Picture a world where the sea could rise in fury at the whim of an enraged god, where love struck like invisible arrows shot by a mischievous deity, and where the sun itself raced across the sky in a chariot of fire. This was the ancient Mediterranean, a place where every storm, every harvest, every twist of fate had a story behind it, a myth to explain the unexplainable. These weren't just tales to pass the time, they were the heartbeat of civilizations, the way people made sense of a world far more mysterious than ours. Today, we're diving deep into 30 of the most bizarre, shocking, and utterly captivating myths from this region. Stories so strange, you'll wonder how anyone ever believed them, and yet, buried within them, you'll find truths about human nature that still resonate today. Think about the last time you heard a thunderclap so loud it made you jump. Now imagine believing that sound wasn't just weather, but the hammer of a towering, bearded god striking his anvil in the clouds. That's how the ancient Greeks saw Zeus, ruler of the skies, but that's just the beginning. Wait until you hear about the Phoenician god who demanded child sacrifices, or the Egyptian prophecy that claimed the Nile would run red with blood centuries before the biblical plagues. These myths weren't just fantastical, they shaped laws, justified wars, and even dictated who lived or died. They were the original conspiracy theories, the ancient world's version of science, religion, and entertainment all rolled into one. What makes these stories so fascinating isn't just their strangeness, it's what they reveal about the people who told them. A myth about a hero descending into the underworld isn't just a ghost story. It's a window into how cultures grappled with the terrifying unknown of death. A tale of a city punished by the gods for its arrogance. That's ancient propaganda, a warning etched into legend. And then there are the myths that defy explanation altogether, like the Roman belief that laughing during a ritual could doom an entire empire, or the Minoan legend of a labyrinth hiding a creature half man, half bull. By the time we're done, you'll see these myths not as dusty old fables, but as living, breathing echoes of the fears, hopes, and wild imaginations of civilizations long gone. So, are you ready to step into their world? Let's begin. Deep beneath the palace of Knossos, in the winding darkness of a maze no mortal could escape, lurked a creature born of nightmare, the Minotaur, half man, half bull, with a hunger for human flesh. But this wasn't just a monster story. To the Minoans of ancient Crete, the myth was tangled with their identity, their rituals, even their architecture. The legend goes that Queen Pasiphae, wife of King Minos, fell under a curse, some say from the god Poseidon, and became obsessed with a sacred bull. Their unnatural union produced the Minotaur, a shame so great that Minos ordered the construction of the labyrinth to hide it away. Every 9 years, 7 Athenian youths and maidens were sent as tribute to be devoured by the beast, until the hero Theseus braved the maze with the help of Minos' own daughter, Ariadne, who gave him a thread to trace his way back out. But here's where history blurs with myth. Archaeologists have found frescoes in Crete showing young men and women somersaulting over the backs of bulls, a dangerous ritual that may have inspired the Minotaur's legend. The Minoans revered bulls as symbols of power and their palaces. They were sprawling complexes with corridors so twisting they might have felt like labyrinths to outsiders. Some scholars argue the Minotaur myth was a way for later Greeks to demonize Minoan culture, painting their rivals as monstrous. Others think it's a metaphor for humanity's struggle against primal instincts, the beast within us all. And then there's the chilling possibility that the sacrifices weren't entirely fictional. Bones found in Crete show evidence of ritualistic killings, though whether they fed a monster or appeased gods, we'll never know for sure. What's undeniable is how the Minotaur's story echoes through time. The labyrinth isn't just stone walls, it's the dark corners of the human psyche, the puzzles we can't solve, the sins we bury. Even the name Minotaur lingers, Minos' bull, a king's shame immortalized, and that thread Ariadne gave Theseus, its hope, the fragile line that guides us out of our own darkness. So next time you hear someone call a complicated building a labyrinth, remember, it all started with a bull, a curse, and a king who thought he could hide his monsters away. The sea has always been a place of mystery and danger, but few creatures struck terror into the hearts of ancient sailors like the Sirens. These weren't just beautiful women with haunting voices, they were the original femme fatales, their songs so irresistibly sweet that sailors would steer their ships straight into jagged rocks, drowning in the icy embrace of the waves. Homer's Odyssey gives us the earliest detailed account. Odysseus, warned by the sorceress Circe, orders his crew to plug their ears with wax and ties himself to the mast, desperate to hear the Sirens' call without dooming his men. But later Roman writers like Ovid added chilling twists. Some claimed the Sirens were winged creatures, part bird and part woman, while others whispered they were the transformed companions of Persephone, cursed to sing forever after failing to protect her from Hades. What's fascinating is how the myth might have grown from real maritime perils. The Mediterranean's rocky coasts and sudden storms were deadly enough, but imagine adding another layer of terror, the eerie, echoing cries of seabirds in fog, or the way wind could whistle through narrow cliffs mimicking human voices. Some historians think the Sirens were inspired by the treacherous straits of Messina, where swirling currents and jagged rocks claimed countless ships. Others suggest the myth reflects a deeper fear, the seductive pull of the unknown, the temptation to abandon safety for the promise of something extraordinary. After all, the Sirens didn't just kill sailors, they offered knowledge, singing of all the secrets of the world, a lure as potent as any siren song today. And then there's the question of why only Odysseus survived. His solution, restrained but still exposed to temptation, hints at an ancient lesson about the duality of human nature. We crave wonder, but unchecked curiosity can destroy us. Even the Sirens' fate carries symbolism. Some versions say they threw themselves into the sea when a mortal resisted their song, as if their power depended on human weakness. Today, we might not fear literal sirens, but their legacy lives on, in warnings about distractions that lead us astray, in stories of artists destroyed by their own gifts, even in the modern term siren song for anything too alluring to resist. So next time you hear a haunting melody or feel the pull of something just out of reach, remember, the Sirens' voices still echo across the centuries, a timeless reminder of the price of surrender. North of the Nile, beyond the scorching sands where even the bravest travelers feared to tread, ancient writers claimed an impossible people dwelled. The Blemmyes, creatures with no heads at all, their faces embedded squarely in their chests. Herodotus, the father of history himself, hinted at them in his writings about Africa's wonders, but it was the Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder who etched them into legend, describing tribes whose mouths and eyes sat where their collarbones should be. Medieval mapmakers, clutching at these ancient whispers, drew them proudly on their parchment, placing these headless men in the blank spaces of the world labeled, "Here be monsters." But how did such a fantastical idea take root? Some scholars point to the real-life Blemmyes, a nomadic people of the eastern desert who wore distinctive headdresses or armor that might have obscured their necks from a distance. Imagine a Roman scout catching a glimpse through the rippling heat, haze a silhouette that, to his startled eyes, seemed to lack a head entirely. Others suggest it was a case of cultural telephone. Travelers' tales of African tribes with elaborate chest tattoos or ritual scarring morphing over centuries into something far stranger. There's even a theory that the myth stems from warriors holding shields high, their faces momentarily hidden behind the upper edge, creating an illusion that stuck in the storyteller's mind long after the battle dust settled. What's truly remarkable is how stubbornly the legend clung to the edges of the known world. When Shakespeare needed a symbol of the exotic and grotesque for Othello, he name-dropped the Blemmyes alongside cannibals and men whose heads grew beneath their shoulders. Centuries later, Spanish conquistadors still carried tales of headless tribes in the New World, proving how myths can outlast empires. In the end, The Blemmyes tell us less about Africa than about the minds of those who invented them, a warning of how easily fear and imagination can reshape the unfamiliar into the monstrous. Today, we might chuckle at the idea, but ask yourself, what modern myths are we crafting about the unknown even now? High on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, where the air hummed with something more than mountain wind, the Oracle of Delphi perched above a crack in the earth, a fissure said to exhale the breath of Apollo himself. For over 1,000 years, kings and peasants alike climbed the sacred path to her temple, desperate for a glimpse of fate. The Pythia, as the oracle was known, would descend into a sunless chamber, seat herself on a three-legged stool above that mysterious vent, and inhale the vapors rising from below. Then, eyes rolling back, body trembling, she'd begin to speak in riddles, words that launched wars, founded colonies, and doomed empires. But was this just theater, or could science explain her divine madness? Recent studies of the temple ruins reveal something startling. Delphi sits atop two geological fault lines where shifting plates could have released ethylene or methane gases known to induce trance-like states. Picture a priestess breathing in air laced with sweet-smelling ethylene, a compound once used as an anesthetic. At low doses, it creates euphoria, blurred vision, even the sensation of floating outside one's body, symptoms eerily similar to ancient accounts of the Pythia's fits. Even more compelling, the temple was built directly over the intersection of those faults, as if the priests knew exactly where the strongest fumes would rise. But Delphi's power wasn't just chemical. The oracle's words were famously ambiguous, like the warning she gave King Croesus of Lydia. If he attacked Persia, a great empire would fall. He assumed she meant his enemies. Turned out it was his own. This wasn't just trickery, it was psychological genius. The vagueness let rulers hear what they wanted, while the temple's prestige lent their decisions divine weight. Alexander the Great visited before his conquests, and Athenian leaders consulted her before every major war. In a world without polls or press conferences, Delphi was the ultimate focus group, a place where human ambition dressed itself in prophecy. What's haunting is how the oracle's decline mirrored Greece's own. As Roman power grew, the vapors reportedly weakened, whether from earthquakes or dwindling faith, until the Pythia fell silent altogether. Today, we might see her as a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing gas and godhood, or how easily power cloaks itself in mystery. But walk those ruins at sunset, stand where the Pythia once trembled between earth and heaven, and ask yourself, did the vapors stop because the gods left, or because we stopped believing they were there? Most of us know Medusa as the snake-haired horror whose gaze could petrify heroes mid-step, but buried beneath that legend lies an older, stranger truth. Before Athena cursed her, before Perseus ever raised his sword, there was a Medusa few remember, a radiant priestess whose laughter carried the same deadly power as her latest stare. In the lost corners of Libya and the islands of the Hesperides, locals whispered of a goddess-turned monster whose joy was as dangerous as her rage. When she threw back her head in delight, her pealing laughter didn't just echo through temples. It froze sailors in their boats, turned soldiers to statues mid-charge, left orchards full of rigid, smiling figures. This alternate version reveals how myths mutate across borders. While Athenians framed Medusa as a violated woman punished for Poseidon's crime, North African traditions often painted her as a sun deity's daughter, her laughter reflecting the desert's unforgiving light, something so brilliant it could halt time itself. Archaeologists have found 4th century pottery showing a beaming Medusa with vines curling from her hair instead of serpents, her open mouth radiating concentric waves like a sonic blast. One fragment even depicts a shepherd caught mid-dance, his face locked in delight as stone creeps up his legs. The duality forces us to ask, why did laughter terrify the ancients as much as wrath? Perhaps because joy, like fear, is uncontrollable. A scream can be stifled, but laughter bursts forth unplanned, making it the perfect metaphor for divine caprice. There's also the subversion of expectations. We brace against monsters, but who prepares defenses against delight? Even her transformation carries new meaning here. If her later snake-haired form petrified through eye contact, maybe the curse didn't diminish her power, just redirected it. Athena didn't destroy Medusa's magic, she weaponized it differently. Modern echoes of this forgotten Medusa linger in our language. We still say someone was paralyzed with laughter, or describe a breathtaking sight as stoning us, phrases that might owe more to her Libyan origins than we realize. And isn't there something deeply human in fearing what we crave? We long for joy, yet know its fleeting nature makes the come-down crueler. Maybe that's why this version faded. A monster who kills with despair is expected, but one who kills with happiness. That's a truth too sharp to face. Long before the Greeks named the constellation Taurus, a much older celestial beast stamped its hooves across the Mesopotamian night sky. Gugulana, the bull of heaven, whose myth intertwines divine fury, tragic love, and humanity's earliest stargazing. In the world's oldest recorded epic, The Descent of Inanna, this monstrous bull isn't just a starry pattern. He's a weapon sent by the gods to punish the Queen of Heaven herself. The story begins with Inanna, the Sumerian goddess of love and war, rejecting the advances of her sister's husband, the underworld god Gugulana. Furious at the insult, the gods unleash Gugulana upon the earth, where his very footsteps cause earthquakes and his snorts summon tornadoes. But when Inanna's mortal lover, the shepherd king Dumuzid, slays the beast, it sets off a chain reaction. Inanna, grieving and guilt-stricken, ventures into the underworld to confront her sister, only to be struck dead and hung on a meat hook for 3 days before her resurrection. What makes this myth so extraordinary isn't just its drama, but how deeply it's etched into humanity's relationship with the cosmos. Gugulana's name literally translates to the Great Bull of Heaven, and scholars believe his constellation, marked by the same V-shaped Hyades cluster we call Taurus today, was Sumer's first celestial clock. Farmers tracked its position to predict floods, priests used it to time rituals. Even the bull's death carries cosmic weight. When Dumuzid kills him, the event coincides with the heliacal setting of Taurus in spring, symbolizing the bull's annual descent beneath the horizon. And here's where it gets eerie. Modern astronomers note that around 4,000 years ago, the spring equinox actually occurred in Taurus, meaning Gugulana's death myth might encode prehistoric observations of celestial shifts. But Gugulana's legacy stretches beyond stars. His horns, said to be lapis lazuli, mirror the sacred bulls of Sumerian temples, massive bronze statues with gemstone eyes, embodiments of divine power. When Inanna descends to the underworld after his death, she's not just mourning a beast, she's confronting the cycle of life, death, and rebirth that the bull represented. Some tablets even suggest Gugulana and Dumuzid were two sides of the same archetype, the untamed bull and the domesticated shepherd, locked in an eternal struggle that mirrored Mesopotamia's shift from hunter-gatherer societies to agrarian life. Today, when we look up at Taurus, we're seeing more than stars. We're glimpsing a 4,000-year-old story of loss, vengeance, and the price of challenging the gods. The myth's endurance raises a haunting question. Did the stars inspire the story, or did the story shape how we see the stars? Perhaps both. Gugulana's rage lives on every time Taurus storms into the night sky. His red eye, the star Aldebaran, glaring down like an unblinking reminder that even heaven's brightest lights are born from ancient bloodshed. Imagine planting a single tooth in the earth, only to watch in horror as the soil erupts with fully armed warriors thirsting for blood. This wasn't just a nightmare, it was a widespread myth that haunted the ancient Mediterranean, appearing first in Phoenician lore before spreading to Greece like a dark fairy tale. The earliest version stars Cadmus, the legendary founder of Thebes, who was ordered to sacrifice a dragon sacred to Ares. When he sewed the beast's teeth into the ground, they sprouted a battalion of skeletal soldiers called the Spartoi, or sewn men. who immediately turned on each other until only 5 remained the ancestors of Thebes' noble families. But what starts as a hero's origin story takes a darker turn when the same teeth reappear generations later in the hands of Jason, stolen from a sleepless dragon at Colchis and used to slaughter his own crewmates. The repetition isn't coincidence. It reveals how deeply this motif was woven into ancient anxieties about agriculture and warfare. Teeth, after all, are the only human seeds that regrow when lost, making them uncanny symbols of regeneration. Add the fact that ancient farmers literally sowed fields by scattering seeds from their hands, just as Cadmus and Jason cast teeth onto the soil, and the metaphor becomes chillingly clear. War, like farming, is a cycle of planting and reaping. Even the Spartoi's behavior mirrors real-world mercenaries, fighters with no loyalty beyond payment, turning on allies as quickly as enemies. Archaeological finds in Phoenicia add weight to the theory. Excavations have uncovered ritual pits filled with animal teeth and weapons, suggesting some cultures may have performed symbolic plantings to invoke martial power. Yet there's another layer here: the teeth's origin from dragons, creatures often linked to sovereignty in Mediterranean myths. By harnessing a dragon's teeth, heroes like Cadmus and Jason weren't just raising armies, they were stealing a monarch's divine right to wage war. That's why the teeth backfire so spectacularly. They're a cursed shortcut to power, exposing the brutality underlying civilized conquest. Modern echoes of this persist in phrases like "dragon's teeth" for hidden traps, or the way societies still grapple with the unintended consequences of militarization. So the next time you hear about a conflict spiraling out of control, remember, it might just be another harvest of those ancient, bloodthirsty teeth. Somewhere beyond the known world, past whirlpools and sea monsters, Homer's Odyssey described an island so blessed by the gods that hunger seemed like a forgotten concept. Phaeacia, where golden halls overflowed with endless feasts and ships required no oars or sails, gliding across the waves with minds of their own. When the shipwrecked Odysseus washes ashore here, he's greeted not just by hospitality, but by a reality where food replenishes itself as if by magic, where dancers never tire, and where the very concept of scarcity doesn't exist. At the center of it all stands King Alcinous, ruler of a people so favored by Poseidon that their vessels navigate autonomously, as swift as thought or winged bird. But was this pure fantasy, or did Homer weave fragments of real, advanced seafaring cultures into his epic? Archaeologists have long noted striking parallels between Phaeacia and the Minoan civilization of Crete, a Bronze Age maritime power whose influence stretched across the Mediterranean. The Minoans built sprawling palace complexes with sophisticated plumbing and storerooms stocked with enough grain, oil, and wine to suggest a level of abundance that might have seemed supernatural to later Greeks. Their vibrant frescoes depict acrobats leaping over bulls and banquets where guests recline on finely woven cushions, scenes eerily reminiscent of Phaeacia's eternal revelry. Even the self-piloting ships find a possible prototype in Minoan thalassocracy. Their advanced navigation techniques and star-based sailing routes might have appeared almost mystical to outsiders. The famed Phaistos disk, with its undeciphered spiral of symbols, hints at knowledge so specialized it could have been mistaken for divine. Yet there's another layer to Phaeacia's myth: its function as a narrative crossroads. This isn't just a pit stop for Odysseus, it's the last magical refuge before he returns to the brutal, real world of Ithaca. The island's perfection makes it a liminal space, a bridge between fairy tale and harsh reality. Tellingly, after delivering Odysseus home, Phaeacia's ships are punished by Poseidon, turned to stone as the island vanishes into legend. Some scholars interpret this as a metaphor for the end of the Bronze Age itself. The collapse of advanced maritime networks around 1200 BCE, when drought and invasion shattered Mediterranean trade routes. The Phaeacians, then, might represent a golden age remembered only in fragments. their technologies so far ahead of Homer's Dark Age Greece that they could only be explained as magic. Modern echoes of this lost paradise persist in our collective imagination. The idea of a land where labor is obsolete and nature provides unconditionally appears everywhere, from the biblical Eden to science fiction's post-scarcity utopias. But perhaps the most haunting connection lies in recent underwater discoveries off Crete, the sunken city of Aulis. Its streets and courtyards preserved beneath the waves like a literal Atlantis. Walking those submerged ruins, one can almost hear the ghostly laughter of Phaeacia's undying banquet, a reminder that every myth of Paradise Lost might contain a kernel of drowned history. So the next time you dream of a world without want, remember, 3,000 years ago, someone was already writing that story, and they might have been mourning a civilization we're only now rediscovering. Even after the Maenads tore Orpheus limb from limb, flinging his head into the rushing waters of the Hebros River, his voice refused to die. The poet's severed head, pale and bloodless, floated downstream, still singing, his lips forming prophecies, his golden lyre drifting beside him like a faithful companion. The myths say his songs grew only more potent in death, carried by the currents until they washed ashore on the island of Lesbos, where locals buried it as a sacred relic. For centuries, pilgrims whispered that the earth itself hummed where his head lay, and that those who pressed their ears to the soil could hear fragments of lost hymns rising from the roots. This wasn't just a grotesque epilogue, it was a collision of Greek myth and older, darker traditions. Across the ancient world, severed heads held power. Celtic warriors displayed the heads of enemies as protective talismans. Norse myths told of Mimir's head whispering wisdom to Odin. Orpheus's fate echoes these beliefs, but with a haunting twist. His voice isn't just preserved, it's amplified, as if death stripped away everything but the pure essence of his art. Some scholars trace this to Thracian shamanism, where dismemberment symbolized spiritual transcendence, the body destroyed so the soul could ascend. The Maenads didn't just kill Orpheus, they unwittingly transformed him into something between a ghost and a god. What chills the spine isn't the violence, but the persistence of that singing. Imagine a fisherman netting a waterlogged head only to hear it murmur a dirge for its own decay. Later poets claimed the head predicted the rise of cities, the fall of kings' knowledge too terrible for the living to bear. Even Apollo, who'd gifted Orpheus his musical genius, intervened at last, silencing the head not out of mercy but jealousy. Here lies the myth's cruelest irony. The god of music feared a mortal's voice more in death than in life. The story lingers like an unresolved chord, asking if true art ever really dies, or if creation outlasts the creator, whispering back when the world least expects it. When Pythagoras gazed up at the moon, he didn't just see a barren rock, he envisioned bustling cities of towering ant-like creatures, their silver carapaces glinting in the eternal sunlight of the lunar highlands. This wasn't mere fantasy. The philosopher and his followers believed the moon's pockmarked surface hid vast colonies of intelligent beings, their society far older and wiser than humanity's. According to fragments of lost texts, these moon ants were said to harvest luminous fungi from the crater floors, weaving it into glowing fabrics that lit their subterranean halls. Even more startling, Pythagoras argued these creatures weren't mythological at all. They were a natural phenomenon, as real as the tides their movements supposedly influenced. This idea didn't emerge from nowhere. Ancient astronomers had long noted the moon's strange, shifting shadows, interpreting them through the lens of their own world. Just as they saw faces and animals in the constellations, the moon's craters became dwellings, its Maria the dark sea's fertile plains. But Pythagoras took it further, blending observation with radical cosmology. His moon wasn't just inhabited, it was a mirror of Earth, with its own ecosystems and civilizations, a concept that wouldn't resurface in Western thought until Kepler's Somnium in the 17th century. Some scholars speculate he drew on even older Near Eastern myths, like the Babylonian belief that the moon god Sin's chariot was pulled by winged insects. The irony is how prescient these myths seem today. Modern sci-fi teems with lunar colonies and alien hive minds, but the core idea that the moon harbors life predates telescopes by millennia. Even the ants themselves find eerie parallels in recent science. In 2019, researchers discovered a species of desert ant that navigates using polarized moonlight, their bodies adapted to extremes that mimic the moon's environment. Could Pythagoras have stumbled onto a metaphor that later science literalized? Or was his vision of lunar ants a poetic way to explain the moon's influence on Earth's creatures, much like its pull on the tides? What's undeniable is how these myths reveal the human instinct to populate the unknown. The same drive that made medieval mapmakers sketch dragons in uncharted waters led the ancients to fill the moon's silence with imagined voices. Today, as we plan lunar bases and mine helium-3, we're still chasing Pythagoras' dream, not of giant ants, but of a moon that's more than a dead rock. The craters he thought were anthills, we now know them as potential shelters for astronauts. His glowing fungi, scientists are experimenting with bioluminescent plants to light future colonies. The line between myth and mission has never been thinner. So the next time you look up at the moon's pale face, remember, 2,500 years ago, someone swore they saw it blink back. Off the coast of Crete, where the Aegean Sea pounds against jagged cliffs, stood history's first robotic sentry, Tolos, a towering bronze giant forged by the god Hephaestus himself. This wasn't just any guardian. Tolos was a marvel of divine engineering, his veins coursing not with blood but with ichor, the golden fluid of immortality. 3 times a day, he circled the island on legs that never tired, his molten metal gaze scanning the horizon for pirates or invaders. When enemies approached, he'd heat his body to a furnace's glow, crush ships in his colossal hands, or hurl boulders with the precision of a catapult. But Tolos' most chilling feature, a single bronze nail sealed his one vulnerable spot at his ankle, where his life force pulsed like a ticking bomb. What makes this myth so fascinating isn't just its spectacle, it's the eerie plausibility behind it. Ancient Crete was a hub of metallurgical innovation, where artisans crafted intricate automatons for temples and theaters. Archaeologists have found Minoan figurines with movable limbs, and texts describe mechanical birds that sang via steam-powered whistles. Even Tolos' ichor might have a real-world counterpart. Recent studies suggest the myth could reference early experiments with liquid mercury, a substance the ancients believed held mystical properties. Some historians speculate Tolos was inspired by the Colossus of Rhodes, another bronze giant, though far less mobile, or even memories of siege engines, their creaking limbs reinterpreted as something alive. But Tolos' story takes a tragic turn. When the Argonauts arrived on Crete, the sorceress Medea didn't outmuscle the giant, she outsmarted him. Exploiting his hubris, she convinced him she could make him immortal by removing the ankle nail. The moment it was pried loose, his ichor drained away, leaving a hollow shell groaning like a broken bell. Here, the myth reveals deeper fears, that technology, no matter how advanced, is only as invincible as its weakest joint. The parallels to modern AI or cybersecurity are uncanny. Our own Tolos figures, from nuclear reactors to firewalls, all have their fatal flaws waiting to be exploited. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of Tolos, though, is how he blurs the line between guardian and prisoner. Some versions of the myth suggest he wasn't just defending Crete, he was bound to it, cursed to march the same path forever. In that sense, he's less a robot and more a mirror, reflecting our own anxieties about creations that might outlast their creators. Today, as drones patrol borders and algorithms govern lives, Tolos stands as a 3,000-year-old warning. Every invention meant to protect us carries the seeds of its own destruction. His bronze carcass, rusting at the edge of myth, whispers that the real vulnerability isn't in the ankle, it's in the hand that forges the nail. In the year 114 BCE, terrified citizens of Rome looked up to see the heavens weeping blood, thick scarlet drops staining marble temples, pooling in the streets like a massacre poured from the clouds. The historian Livy recorded it as divine wrath, proof the gods had turned against Rome. Similar accounts appear across centuries. Pliny the Elder wrote of a blood rain that fell for 3 days after Julius Caesar's murder, while Byzantine chroniclers described crimson downpours heralding the fall of cities. These weren't isolated superstitions, they were panic carved into history, the ancient world's attempt to explain a phenomenon modern science now understands, the eerie dance of dust and wind across continents. What made these blood rains so chilling was their unpredictability. Unlike comets or eclipses which could be tracked, the sky's sudden bleeding seemed arbitrary, a celestial punishment without warning. Scholars now suspect many were caused by microscopic algae or Saharan dust storms, where iron-rich particles mixed with rain to paint the world red. In 2001, a blood rain drenched southern India, staining clothes and startling farmers until researchers identified the culprit, spores of a European algae species, carried thousands of miles by high-altitude winds. Similar events occur when desert sands from the Sahara cross the Mediterranean, tinting rain rusty as it falls on Greece or Italy. But the ancients didn't have spectrometers, they had omens. Roman priests scrutinized these rains like divine telegrams, passing their timing and location for clues. A blood shower over a battlefield, Mars approving the slaughter. Red drops on a senator's villa, a warning of betrayal. The irony is how often these omens aligned with real upheaval. Caesar's death did plunge Rome into civil war, and the 114 BCE reign preceded disastrous military campaigns. Coincidence or something more? Some historians argue the reigns became self-fulfilling prophecies, their interpretations steering human actions toward the very disasters they predicted. Perhaps the most haunting legacy of these myths is how they reveal the terror of an indifferent universe. To the Romans, blood rain meant the gods were watching. Today, we know it's just physics, yet when the sky turns strange, don't we still feel that ancient shiver? The next time you see a sunset stained crimson by distant wildfires, remember, you're breathing the same fear that once made emperors kneel. The heavens never stopped weeping, only our explanations changed. Every civilization has its symbols of eternity, but few burned as brightly or as literally as the phoenix. This mythical sun bird didn't just cheat death, it welcomed annihilation with wings outstretched, knowing flames couldn't destroy it, only renew it. The earliest version hails from Heliopolis, Egypt, where priests told of the Bennu, a heron-like creature that rose with the dawn, its feathers gold and crimson like the sunrise itself. Every 500 years, when the Bennu felt age creeping in, it would build a nest of cinnamon and myrrh, then let the desert wind ignite it in a blaze so intense even the gods turned their faces. From those ashes, a new Bennu would emerge, carrying the memories of all its past lives in its glittering eyes. But this wasn't just a pretty metaphor for the sunrise. The phoenix's rebirth cycle mirrored ancient Egypt's obsession with time itself. Their calendar divided years into lifetimes of 500 years, meaning the bird's resurrection coincided with cosmic renewal. When Greek travelers heard these tales, they reshaped the Bennu into the phoenix we know today, blending it with their own myth of the fire-born eagle. By the time Roman emperors adopted it, the bird had become a propaganda tool. Augustus famously minted coins with the phoenix to cement his claim of ushering in a new golden age after civil war. What's fascinating is how each culture projected its deepest anxieties onto the phoenix. To Egyptians, it was a celestial clock. Greeks saw it as proof of the soul's indestructibility. Plato even compared Socrates to the bird, arguing wisdom couldn't be burned away. Romans twisted it into political theater, yet beneath all these layers, the core idea endured: destruction as a form of purification. That's why early Christians later repurposed the symbol for resurrection, painting it in catacomb art as a promise to martyrs. Modern science gives this myth an eerie resonance. Some stars, like our sun, actually do undergo cycles of death and rebirth, expanding into red giants before collapsing back into new forms. Even DNA repairs itself through processes nicknamed biological pyrotechnics, as if our cells remember the phoenix's lesson. So the next time you watch a forest fire give way to green shoots, remember, that bird's shadow stretches farther than you think. It turns out immortality wasn't in avoiding the flames, it was in learning to rise from them. Among the most persistent and bizarre legends of the ancient Mediterranean were the cynosphali, literally dog-headed men, said to roam the distant deserts of Africa and Asia. Greek explorers like Herodotus wrote of encountering entire tribes with the snarling faces and sharp teeth of hounds, their speech more bark than language. Even the usually skeptical Pliny the Elder included them in his Encyclopedia of Natural Wonders, describing warriors who communicated through howls and growls under the full moon. But what began as travelers' tall tales took a shocking turn centuries later when these monstrous figures reappeared in an unlikely context: Christian hagiography, transformed into pious saints worthy of veneration. The earliest accounts likely stemmed from misinterpretations of real African traditions. Some scholars point to the Garamantes, a nomadic people of the Sahara known for wearing jackal skin headdresses in rituals honoring Anubis, the Egyptian god of death. Imagine a Greek merchant catching a glimpse of such a ceremony through the heat haze, the distorted silhouette of figures with elongated, animal-like profiles chanting in an unfamiliar tongue. Others suggest the myth grew from encounters with baboons, whose human-like social behaviors and sharp canines might have been exaggerated into something more sinister across generations of retelling. By the time these stories reached medieval Europe, the cynosphali had become fixtures on "Here Be Monsters" maps, often placed alongside giants and dragons at the edges of the known world. Yet the most fascinating twist came when early Christian writers rehabilitated these creatures. The most famous case is Saint Christopher, who in some Eastern Orthodox traditions was depicted as a dog-headed convert, his ferocious appearance contrasting with his gentle role as the patron saint of travelers. Syrian manuscripts describe how this cynosphalous bishop preached the gospel through miraculous translation, his growls becoming divinely intelligible speech. Even Augustine weighed in, debating whether such beings could possess souls. This wasn't just theological whimsy, it reflected Christianity's drive to universalize salvation, to prove no creature, no matter how monstrous, was beyond redemption. What makes these dog-headed men so enduring isn't just their strangeness, but what they reveal about the power of storytelling. A myth born from cultural misunderstanding became first a symbol of otherness, then a test of faith's boundaries. Today, we might see echoes of the cynosphali in how societies still dehumanize the unfamiliar, or in the inverse, our willingness to embrace the seemingly alien. After all, if a barking saint could find a place in heaven, perhaps no one is truly beyond understanding. The next time you hear someone called wild or beastly, remember, 3,000 years ago they might have painted him with fur and fangs, only to later crown him with a halo. After narrowly escaping the Cyclops' wrath and outrunning the storms of angry gods, Odysseus and his starving crew finally stumbled onto an island that seemed like salvation: soft sand, whispering palms, and trees heavy with fragrant fruit unlike anything they'd tasted before. The locals, moving in languid rhythms, offered them lotus blossoms with drowsy smiles, but this wasn't just hospitality, it was oblivion in petal form. Homer describes how Odysseus' men, after eating the lotus fruit, lost all memory of home, their minds adrift in euphoria as they murmured about staying forever in this hazy paradise. The king of Ithaca had to physically drag his sailors back to the ships, their hands still clutching the blossoms as they wept for the shore fading behind them. The genius of this myth lies in its layers. On one level, it's a straightforward warning about the dangers of indulgence. the lotus as ancient Mediterranean opioid, perhaps inspired by real narcotic plants like the blue lotus Nymphaea caerulea, which Egyptian priests used in rituals for its trance-inducing effects. Archaeologists have found traces of this very flower in Bronze Age wine jugs, suggesting its mind-altering properties were well known. Yet the story digs deeper, tapping into one of antiquity's deepest fears, the terror of losing one's identity. To forget Ithaca wasn't just to abandon a place, it was to surrender Greekness itself, to dissolve into the faceless bliss of the foreign. Notice how Homer never names the lotus eaters as individuals. They're a collective, a cultural antithesis to Odysseus' hyper-individualized heroism. But there's an even darker reading here. The myth likely reflects early Greek encounters with North African or Levantine cultures where plant-based rituals were commonplace. To a society that prized clarity and reason, the idea of voluntary intoxication was unthinkable, yet these barbarians seemed to embrace it willingly. Some scholars argue the lotus eaters embody colonial anxieties, a nightmare vision of what happened when Greeks abroad went native, seduced by the comforts of foreign land. The sailors desperate clinging to the fruit mirrors real historical accounts of mercenaries or traders who assimilated into Egyptian or Persian society, abandoning their homelands for new loyalties. Even the fruit's description, honey sweet, impossible to resist, parallels Greek writings about the luxurious corruption of Eastern courts. Modern parallels are everywhere. The lotus myth resurfaces in stories of soldiers addicted to opium during the Napoleonic Wars, or the fear of Westerners disappearing into Eastern spirituality during the 1960s. At its core, the legend asks, what's more terrifying, the danger you can fight, or the pleasure that makes you forget fighting altogether? Odysseus' men faced Scylla and Charybdis with courage, but the lotus nearly undid them with a sigh. That's why this episode lingers in the imagination long after the monsters fade. It's not the teeth of the Cyclops or the song of the Sirens that truly threatens. It's the part of us that might, just for a moment, prefer the dream to the journey home. The real horror of the lotus eaters isn't the fruit, it's the realization that nostalgia is a fragile thing. One taste and the war at Troy becomes a half-remembered dream. Penelope's face blurs like a face seen underwater, and the very concept of home dissolves like sugar on the tongue. The myth forces us to wonder, if given the choice between the struggle of memory and the peace of forgetting, how many of us would reach for the lotus? And what does that say about the stories we tell ourselves to keep going? Deep in the shadowed halls of Egyptian temples, where incense curled around pillars carved with gods' faces, visitors sometimes witnessed the impossible statues that lifted their arms in blessing, turned their heads to follow the faithful, or even spoke prophecies in voices like grinding stone. The Greek historian Herodotus described one such marvel at Thebes, where a colossal statue of Ammon reportedly selected its own priests by nodding at chosen candidates. Similar accounts appear across centuries, a Memphite idol said to pour libations on its own, a Horus figure in Edfu that allegedly raised its spear to signal divine approval. These weren't mere legends. Temple inscriptions detail meticulous rituals to awaken statues, including the opening of the mouth ceremony where priests touched golden tools to carved lips, literally breathing life into stone. The secrets behind these moving idols reveal an astonishing blend of engineering and psychology. Archaeologists have discovered temple floors with hidden grooves, tracks allowing statues mounted on concealed sleds to be pulled by ropes from hidden chambers. Some bore hollow interiors with speaking tubes, letting priests project voices as if the gods themselves spoke. The most sophisticated might have used mercury or counterweights to simulate autonomous movement, techniques later echoed in Hero of Alexandria's mechanical treatises. But the real genius lay in the staging. Flickering torchlight obscured operators, while rhythmic chanting covered the sound of grinding mechanisms. To a believer already trembling in the god's presence, even a slight tremor in the statue's hand would feel like a thunderous divine gesture. Yet reducing these phenomena to mere trickery misses their profound cultural role. The statue's movements weren't just theater, they were sacred contracts between heaven and earth. When Ammon's statue chose a priest, it validated political succession in a society where religion and state were inseparable. The speaking idols of oracle temples provided divine sanction for wars and treaties. Their voices, though priest-controlled, carried the weight of cosmic law. Even the mechanics held spiritual meaning. The same pulley systems that animated statues were used to lift temple obelisks, blurring the line between practical engineering and divine intervention. Modern parallels abound. From animatronics in theme parks to AI chatbots framed as oracles, we still crave the illusion of lifeless matter gaining consciousness. The ancient priests understood something fundamental about human psychology, that faith thrives in the liminal space between knowing and wonder. When archaeologists recently scanned a supposedly miraculous medieval crucifix and found its moving eyes were powered by a simple clockwork mechanism, it didn't diminish the artifact's power, it revealed how deeply we'll suspend disbelief for a glimpse of magic. The next time your phone's voice assistant answers unasked, remember, 4,000 years ago, someone was bowing to a bronze mouth that moved just as mysteriously, asking it questions about the future while ignoring the human hand shaping its replies. What makes these myths endure isn't just the ingenuity behind them, but the uncomfortable question they force us to confront: where does the machine end and the divine begin? The priests who operated these statues likely believed in their own holy stagecraft, just as a magician knows the trick but still feels awe in its performance. In an age where algorithms shape our choices as subtly as Ammon's nodding statue, we might be closer to those ancient temples than we think, still kneeling before creations we pretend don't have strings attached. She was once a queen, Libya's radiant ruler, her laughter echoing through marble courtyards, her arms wrapped around children of her own. Then the gods turned her into something else entirely. Lamia's descent from royalty to monster begins with a jealousy so venomous it still chills the blood. According to the oldest versions of her myth, she caught the eye of Zeus himself, and when Hera discovered their affair, the goddess didn't just punish her rival, she destroyed Lamia's entire world. One by one, the queen watched her children die, their breath stolen by Hera's curse. Then came the real torment. Lamia was cursed with restless eyes that never closed, forced to witness every horror without the relief of sleep. But the kingdom didn't see her grief, they saw the madness that followed. In her agony, she began stealing other women's children, tearing into their flesh with teeth that had once smiled at courtly feasts. By the time the Greeks retold her story, Lamia had become something far worse. A hollow-eyed demon who slithered into nurseries at night, her upper body alluring, her lower half scaled like a serpent with an unquenchable hunger for the young. What makes Lamia so terrifying isn't just her actions, it's how fluidly she crossed the line between human and monster. Earlier Libyan myths paint her as a grieving mother turned vengeful spirit, a cautionary tale about the dangers of divine wrath. But Greek writers amplified her monstrosity, describing her ability to pluck out her own eyes to momentarily escape her curse, only for them to regrow by morning. Some accounts claim she could shapeshift into beautiful women to lure victims, foreshadowing later vampire legends. By the Roman era, parents whispered her name to frighten disobedient children, much like the boogeyman, but with a gruesome twist. If kids stayed out too late, Lamia wouldn't just get them, she'd savor them, feasting slowly to prolong their suffering. The myth's evolution reveals ancient anxieties about motherhood, loss, and the thin veneer of civilization. Lamia's transformation from victim to predator reflects a primal fear that grief, unchecked, can mutate into something monstrous. Archaeologists have found protective amulets in Greek and Roman nurseries engraved with spells to ward her off, proving how deeply the terror of child-snatching demons permeated daily life. But there's another layer here. Lamia's serpentine lower body links her to older, Near Eastern fertility goddesses like Lilith, suggesting her myth might have roots in the demonization of pre-Olympian deities. By the Middle Ages, Lamia's legend had slithered into vampire lore. Travelers' accounts from the Balkans described pale, child-hunting creatures called Blemmyes, blending her myth with Slavic undead. Even the poet John Keats resurrected her in the 19th century, portraying her as a beautiful but lethal seductress who drained lovers of their vitality, a direct ancestor of modern vampire tropes. Today, her name lingers in medical terminology. Lamia syndrome describes delusions of being a snake, while her story echoes in horror films about maternal figures gone rogue. The real horror of Lamia's tale isn't her fangs or her scales. It's the moment she stops weeping for her lost children and starts stealing yours. She's a warning etched in myth: some wounds don't scar. They fester, twisting love into hunger, sorrow into predation. And in a world where mothers still bury children, where grief still drives some to madness, her story feels less like a fairy tale and more like a mirror held up to the darkest corners of human despair. So the next time you hear a rustle in the nursery or glimpse movement in the shadows, remember, monsters aren't always born. Sometimes they're unmade by gods who mistake suffering for justice. And the most terrifying part, under the right kind of pain, any of us could become Lamia. At the edge of all medieval maps, beyond the known seas where dragons coiled around the words, "Here be monsters," stood a peak so terrible that seasoned sailors whispered about it in taverns: the Magnetic Mountain. Arab traders called it Jabal al-Maghita, the Mountain of Attraction, while Sinbad the sailor barely escaped its grasp in his legendary voyages. According to these tales, any ship venturing too close would find its iron nails and fittings wrenched violently from the hull, timbers splintering as the vessel disintegrated into driftwood. The mountain didn't just sink ships, it devoured them, swallowing every scrap of metal into its invisible jaws before the screaming crew could swim to safety. What's fascinating is how these stories emerged from real geological oddities. The Mediterranean basin holds massive deposits of magnetite, an iron ore so magnetic, ancient Chinese navigators used it to craft the first compasses. In places like Mount Ida in Crete or certain cliffs near Magnesia, the region that gave Magnet its name, the pull is strong enough to disrupt compass needles even today. Phoenician traders likely noticed this first, their bronze-clad ships suddenly veering off course near specific coastlines, their tools inexplicably sticking to rocks. Without understanding geomagnetism, they spun these encounters into legends of cursed mountains that ate metal. By the time these tales reached medieval Europe, they'd merged with broader lore. The 12th century Alexandria scroll describes a black mountain beyond Persia that crushed Alexander the Great's fleet by dragging their armor right off their bodies. Even Christopher Columbus's logs mention strange compass deviations near the Azores, which his superstitious crew blamed on underwater versions of the Magnetic Mountain. The myth persisted because it explained two genuine maritime dangers: shipwrecks near rocky coasts where magnetic anomalies masked true north, and the mysterious disintegration of older vessels whose iron nails corroded unseen beneath the hull, only to give way catastrophically in rough seas. Science eventually demystified the phenomenon, but the mountain's legacy lingers. Modern ships still account for magnetic declination when navigating, and geologists study magnetic anomalies to map mineral deposits. Yet there's poetry in how the ancients personified these forces, imagining the mountain not as a passive rock, but as a hungry titan guarding the edge of the world. The next time your phone's compass glitches near a granite outcrop, think of Sinbad's terror as his ship cracked apart, plank by plank, pulled toward a peak that didn't just exist on maps, but in the liminal space between observation and myth. Some legends fade when tested by reason. This one simply changed shape. trading its monsters for polarity but keeping all its primal power to unsettle. High above the turquoise waters of Turkey's southern coast, where the cliffs of Mount Olympus crumble into the sea, flames flicker from the earth itself, not in bursts but in a relentless dance that has continued since before the Greeks named this place Lycia. Ancient sailors swore these were the breath of the Chimera, the fire-breathing monster slain by the hero Bellerophon. According to myth, the beast's dying embers sank into the stone, leaving behind an eternal fire that no rain could quench and no wind could scatter. For centuries, travelers made pilgrimages to these flames, lighting their torches from what they believed was the Chimera's still beating heart. Today, we know these fires as the unnautash methane vents, a geological marvel that turns myth into reality with every flickering blue tongue of flame. What makes this phenomenon so extraordinary isn't just its persistence, but the science behind its survival. The vents tap into a vast underground reservoir of methane gas, seeping through cracks in the rock to ignite spontaneously upon contact with air. Unlike ordinary wildfires, these flames don't consume wood or oil. They feed on an invisible fuel source deep beneath the earth, burning at temperatures hot enough to blister skin but cool enough to hover a hand just inches above the fire, a paradox that must have seemed like divine magic to ancient observers. The Lycians built altars around the flames, offering sacrifices to appease the Chimera's restless spirit, while Roman engineers attempted and failed to harness the fires for practical use. Even Byzantine sailors used them as a natural lighthouse, their eerie glow cutting through Mediterranean storms, yet the Chimera's legend predates all these cultures. Hittite tablets from the 2nd millennium BCE describe a mountain of fire gods, likely referencing the same vents. Some scholars argue the myth reflects early encounters with fossil fuels. Imagine stumbling upon an unquenchable fire in an era when torches required constant tending. The symbolism is equally potent, a hybrid creature, part lion, part goat, part serpent, its very body a fusion of elements, just like the flames that blend Earth's hidden gases with air's oxygen. Modern visitors to Yanatash still report a sense of the uncanny, especially at dusk when the fires cast long shadows across the ruins of the temple built to tame them. What's haunting is how the Chimera's duality endures. To the ancients, it was both monster and miracle, destroyer and life-giver. Its flames could cook food or incinerate villages depending on human hands. Today, those same fires represent a frontier of renewable energy research, as scientists study natural methane vents to better understand greenhouse gas emissions. The mythslayers remind us that every scientific marvel begins as a story, and every story holds a kernel of truth waiting to be uncovered. So the next time you hear of wildfires raging out of control, remember, millennia ago, people knelt before flames that refused to die, whispering prayers to a beast they couldn't see but whose breath they felt on their faces every night. Some legends don't fade, they just change names. Deep in the pine-covered highlands of Arcadia, where the air smelled of damp earth and wild herbs, a secret cult gathered under the full moon not to worship the gods but to become beasts. The Lycaea, as these rituals were known, centered on a sacrifice so unholy, its participants claimed it transformed them into wolves for 9 years. Ancient Greek historians wrote of young men stripping naked before an altar, their bodies smeared with ash as they devoured raw flesh from a slaughtered child or goat, depending on which account you believe. Those who partook allegedly wandered the wilderness as lupine monsters, their human memories fading with each hunt until the curse lifted. But was this savage legend just moral panic, or did something far stranger happen in those mist-shrouded forests? The key might lie in the Arcadian landscape itself. The region's remote valleys grew a peculiar mix of plants: belladonna, henbane, and ergot-infested barley, all capable of inducing violent hallucinations. Modern ethnobotanists suggest the wolf transformation could have been a nightmarish trip where participants, drugged by tainted sacramental wine or ritual bread, genuinely believed their bones were cracking into new shapes. Supporting this theory, artifacts found near Mount Lycaon include votive wolf masks and carvings of humans mid-transformation, their faces twisted between agony and ecstasy. Even the timing fits. The Lycaea coincided with the August heatwave, when ergot fungus on grains was most potent, yet the ritual served a darker social function. Arcadia was Greece's wilderness, its people stereotyped as backward and uncivilized by city-dwelling Athenians. The werewolf myth reinforced this divide, a warning about what happened when humans rejected Poli's life for the untamed mountains. Some scholars argue the Lycaea was an initiation rite for warrior bands, with the wolf symbolism embodying the ferocity needed to guard Arcadia's borders. Others see parallels with Indo-European coming-of-age rituals, where youth symbolically died as boys and resurrected as men through ordeal and allegorical cannibalism. The most chilling evidence comes from Plato, who casually mentioned in The Republic that a man who tasted human flesh mixed with sacrificial meat was doomed to become a wolf. This wasn't just metaphor. Arcadian legal inscriptions prescribed execution for cannibalism, suggesting the practice or fear of it was real. Excavations at Mount Lycaon's ash altar revealed charred animal and human bones intermingled, though whether this points to ritual violence or later contamination remains debated. What lingers isn't just the horror, but the duality of the wolf in Greek thought. Unlike later European werewolf myths, Arcadians saw lycanthropy as both curse and sacred privilege, a temporary descent into savagery that, if survived, granted uncanny prowess in battle and hunting. The legend's endurance reveals a universal tension, civilization's fear of the beast within, and the terrifying knowledge that sometimes letting it out is the only way to survive. Today, when we shudder at werewolf films, we're channeling that same ancient tremor, the suspicion that under a full moon, in the right or wrong conditions, any of us might wake up with dirt under our nails and the taste of blood in our mouth. So were the Lycaea's wolves real, perhaps not in the Hollywood sense, but in the flickering firelight of those mountain rites, with hallucinogens burning through their veins and wolf pelts heavy on their shoulders. The participants didn't need Hollywood. They had something far more primal, the unshakable belief that for one night they'd touched the animal heart of the world, and it had bitten back, somewhere west of Sicily, beyond the reach of ordinary sails. Ancient sailors whispered of an island that refused to stay put, Aeolia, the drifting kingdom of the wind god Aeolus. Homer's Odyssey paints it as a floating fortress, its bronze walls rising sheer from the sea, encircling a palace where the master of storms kept the winds themselves locked away in leather bags. Yet later writers like Virgil and Ovid spun even stranger versions, some describing the island as suspended in midair by divine will, others claiming it could vanish into mist at a moment's notice. What unites these accounts is the sheer terror and wonder the concept provoked. Land that defied the most fundamental rule of geography, moving not with the tides but with the whims of the gods. This myth likely grew from real seafaring hazards. The Lipari Islands near Sicily traditionally linked to Aeolus are volcanic, prone to sudden fog banks and strange atmospheric effects. A ship caught in shifting winds near these isles might genuinely feel the land itself was in motion. Even more compelling are the rare, floating island illusions caused by temperature inversions, where distant land appears to hover above the horizon. Combine that with the Mediterranean's notorious local winds, like the Sirocco's abrupt gusts, and you have the perfect recipe for legends of runaway landmasses. Yet Aeolia wasn't just a navigational nightmare. Its mythology reflects ancient attempts to explain the unseen forces governing weather. Aeolus's bag of winds symbolizes the delicate balance of atmospheric pressures. Loose one knot, and chaos ensues as Odysseus's crew disastrously discovers. The island's mobility also embodies the capriciousness of maritime life, where safe harbors could become death traps with a shift in the wind. Later Roman writers amplified this, portraying Aeolia as a divine weather station where storms were manufactured before being unleashed. The real fascination lies in how this myth evolved alongside seafaring technology. Early Greek accounts emphasized the island's physicality, bronze walls anchored to the seafloor. But by the Roman era, as ships grew more sophisticated, Aeolia becomes increasingly ethereal, less a place than a phenomenon. Medieval Mappa Mundi would later depict it as a cloud-ringed enigma, drifting at the edge of known waters. Today, we see echoes of Aeolia in everything from floating cities proposed by futurists to the way modern meteorology still personifies weather systems. The myth's core tension between control and chaos resonates whenever we check a storm forecast, hoping the winds stay locked away a little longer. Next time you feel a sudden gust out of nowhere, consider maybe somewhere a divine bag has sprung a leak. Deep in the pestilent marshes of Lerna, where sulphurous mists curled over brackish waters, lurked a horror unlike any other. The Hydra, a serpent with not one, not five, but countless writhing heads, each deadlier than the last. More than just a monster to be slain, this creature was a living nightmare of regeneration, sprouting 2 new heads for every one Heracles managed to hack off with his sword. But beneath the gory spectacle of this myth lies a startling possibility, that the Hydra's uncanny biology might have been inspired by real creatures lurking in those same ancient swamps. Take a closer look at the Hydra's most infamous trait, its heads. Ancient texts describe them as more than just multiple maws. They were semi-independent, some breathing poison, others snapping with razor-sharp fangs, each seemingly with a mind of its own. Now consider the octopus, a creature Mediterranean fishermen would have encountered regularly. With its 8 writhing arms, each capable of taste and limited decision-making, it's eerily reminiscent of the Hydra's many-headed chaos. Even the monster's alleged immortality mirrors the octopus's astonishing regenerative abilities. Some species can regrow entire limbs in weeks, a feat that would have seemed supernatural to ancient observers. Yet the Hydra wasn't just biology run amok, it was a metaphor carved in scales and venom. Swamps like Lerna were liminal spaces to the Greeks, neither land nor water, places where rules dissolved into rot and rebirth. The Hydra embodied this paradox, its heads multiplied when struck, turning violence against the attacker, much like how draining a marsh often leads to new, unexpected floods. Even Heracles' eventual solution, searing each neck stump with fire, reflects ancient land management practices where farmers used controlled burns to prevent regrowth. The monster's poison takes the symbolism further. Unlike straightforward venom, the Hydra's breath and blood were said to taint entire landscapes, lingering long after its death. When Heracles dipped his arrows in its bile, he weaponized this corruption, foreshadowing how later heroes and empires would misuse conquered resources. Archaeologists have found Bronze Age arrowheads near Lerna coated in toxic substances, evidence that the myth might encode real memories of poisoned warfare. Perhaps most haunting is how the Hydra's legacy slithered into modern thought. The term Hydra-headed problem still describes crises that multiply when attacked, from insurgencies to pandemics. Even its regenerative ability inspires cancer research, where scientists study similar cellular mechanisms in tumors. The myth endures because it captures a primal truth. Some threats don't just resist destruction, they feed on it, turning every blow into fuel for their resurgence. So was the Hydra purely imaginary? Maybe not entirely. Next time you see an octopus arm twist away from its body as if with a will of its own, or hear of a toxic spill seeping through groundwater, remember, the swamp monster of Lerna never really died. It just learned to wear new skins. Herodotus, the so-called father of history, spun a tale so bizarre it left scholars scratching their heads for centuries. Giant ants, the size of foxes, that dug up gold dust in the deserts of what is now Pakistan. According to his writings, these monstrous insects burrowed beneath the sands of the Persian Empire's eastern frontier, piling up precious metal as they went, while local tribes risked deadly heat and vipers to steal their treasure. It sounds like pure fantasy, but what if these ants weren't insects at all? The key to unraveling this myth lies in the high-altitude deserts of the Himalayas, where an unlikely creature scuttles across the rocks, the marmot. These large, burrowing rodents, golden-furred and fox-sized, dig extensive tunnel networks, kicking up mineral-rich soil as they go. To Persian traders who'd never seen such animals, their odd movements might have resembled oversized ants at work. Even more compelling, the region's indigenous Minotaur people still practice a form of gold panning in marmot-dug earth, sifting through displaced sediment for flakes carried down from the mountains. Linguistics offers another clue. The old Persian word for marmot was close to their term for mountain ant, a translation error that could have snowballed as the story passed from caravan to caravan. By the time Herodotus recorded it in Greece, the marmots had fully metamorphosed into mythical insects. Later writers like Pliny the Elder added embellishments, claiming the ants were as swift as camels and would attack gold thieves with terrifying ferocity. But the myth's endurance reveals more than a simple mix-up. These gold-digging ants became a cultural shorthand for the exotic riches of the East, a motif that reappears in medieval accounts of Prester John's kingdom and even Marco Polo's travels. The irony: modern geologists confirm the Indus Valley region does contain alluvial gold deposits, often concentrated near rodent burrows where water flow is disrupted. So were Herodotus' ants real, in a sense, yes, just not the way he imagined. The next time you dismiss an ancient myth as pure fiction, remember, even the wildest tales often have roots in the soil of misunderstanding, waiting for someone to dig deeper. And in this case, the treasure wasn't just gold. It was the hidden connection between language, observation, and the stories we tell to make sense of the strange and distant. Long after the Colossus of Rhodes lay toppled by earthquake winds, travelers still swore the fallen giant wasn't entirely silent. According to accounts from geographer Strabo and others, the ruins of the bronze titan produced an eerie, mournful music, a metallic hum resonating through the harbor whenever storms rolled in. The locals called it the voice of Helios, believing the sun god still sang through his shattered likeness. But the truth behind this acoustic phenomenon reveals just how ingenious ancient engineering truly was. When the Colossus collapsed in 226 BCE after standing for just 54 years, the broken sections didn't just crumple, they became accidental instruments. Modern metallurgists suggest the statue's bronze plates, warped by the quake but still partially connected, would have functioned like massive wind chimes. Rhodes' notorious seasonal gusts blowing through the hollow limbs and fractured torso could create standing waves inside the cavities, producing those ghostly tones. Even more fascinating, the statue's copper content, estimated at over 13 tons, would have oxidized unevenly where seawater met the broken edges, creating micro-fissures that amplified specific harmonic frequencies. Essentially, the ruins became a colossal Aeolian harp, turning the very forces that destroyed it into a source of unearthly music. This wasn't just random noise. Ancient texts describe the sounds as following distinct patterns, rising to a crescendo during winter gales, falling nearly silent in summer. Some accounts even claim the tones changed pitch when sections were looted over centuries, implying the intact structure had been acoustically tuned. Archaeologists have found similar sound phenomena in other bronze artifacts from the period, like the singing statues of Delphi, whose hollow interiors were engineered to resonate during religious ceremonies. The Colossus, then, might have been designed with sonic effects in mind, not just a visual marvel, but an auditory one whose voice outlasted its form. What makes this myth so haunting isn't just the science, but how it redefines destruction. Most ancient wonders fell into silence, but the Colossus transformed its own ruin into a new kind of monument. Those eerie notes carried more than vibration, they carried memory, turning every storm into a requiem for what was lost. Today, as engineers study wind-powered sound sculptures and singing bridges, they're unknowingly chasing the same magic that once echoed through road-shattered harbor. The next time you hear metal groan in the wind, listen closely. You might just hear the last echoes of a fallen giant still singing across 22 centuries. Homer's Cyclopes were more than just monsters, they were master craftsmen, builders of colossal walls, and most chillingly, unapologetic devourers of human flesh. When Odysseus stumbled into Polyphemus' cave, he didn't just find a giant with a single eye, he encountered a creature who treated men like livestock, smashing their skulls against stone and washing them down with wine. But what if these nightmarish beings weren't pure invention? Buried in the soil of Mediterranean islands lies a bizarre clue. Skulls the size of small cars with gaping nasal cavities so large they could easily be mistaken for solitary eye sockets. These remains belong not to giants, but to dwarf elephant species like Paleoloxodon falconeri, which shrunk over generations after being stranded on islands like Sicily and Malta. Cut off from mainland populations, they evolved into creatures no taller than a man, yet retained massive skulls with hollow central openings where trunks once anchored. To ancient Greeks discovering these fossils, the implications would have been terrifying. Imagine stumbling upon a weathered skull in a seaside cave, its single central cavity staring up like a blinded eye, its molars resembling human teeth scaled to monstrous proportions. Even the name Cyclops might stem from this misunderstanding, cycle for circular, ops for eye, a perfect description of those elephantine nasal holes. But the connections run deeper than anatomy. The Cyclops roll as blacksmiths in Hesiod's Theogony, forging Zeus lightning bolts in volcanic caverns, mirrors real Mediterranean geography. Many dwarf elephant fossils are found near sulfurous vents and basalt formations, areas rich in metals like copper and iron. Early miners working these sites could have interpreted the bones as remnants of previous metalworkers, their massive skulls proof of the strength needed to shape divine weapons. Even the cannibalism angle finds an eerie parallel in cut marks found on some fossilized elephant bones, suggesting prehistoric humans butchered and possibly ritualistically consumed these creatures. The myth's endurance speaks to how easily fragments of the past morph into legend. Dwarf elephants vanished around 11,000 years ago, yet their fossilized remains continued shaping human imagination millennia later. Modern paleontologists have even coined the term Cyclops hypothesis for how ancient peoples misinterpreted megafauna bones, a process seen globally from dragon legends inspired by dinosaur fossils to Native American tales of water monsters based on mastodon remains. What's truly unsettling is how Polyphemus' brutality gains new dimensions through this lens. Those dwarf elephants weren't predators. They were victims hunted to extinction by humans. Perhaps the Cyclops myth encodes a guilty memory, transforming our ancestral prey into monstrous pursuers. When Odysseus plunges a burning stake into Polyphemus' eye, is it just heroism or the echo of an older violence retold from the predator's perspective? The next time you read about Cyclops, remember, every monster story might just be a fossil out of place, waiting for the right light to reveal its true shape. Long before Medusa's gaze turned men to stone, her legend slithered through the sun-baked temples of Libya, where warrior priestesses wore live serpents as crowns and danced with blades under the desert moon. The earliest depictions of Gorgons hail not from Greece but from North Africa, terracotta amulets and cave paintings showing fierce women with writhing hair, their tongues lolling like serpents, their faces frozen in battle roars. These weren't monsters, they were protectors, embodiments of the Libyan Amazons who guarded sacred oases and served as living weapons for the goddess Neith. a deity of war and weaving whose symbols included crossed arrows and the unblinking eye. When Greek colonists traded along the Libyan coast, they brought these images home, but stripped of their divinity. The serpent-haired women became grotesque, a warning against the foreign and feminine power that threatened patriarchal order. The transformation wasn't accidental. Compare the artifacts. Libyan Gorgons appear in postures of ecstatic ritual, their serpent locks vibrating like the strings of a lyre, while Greek versions contort into grimaces of pure horror. Even Medusa's name hints at her origins. Some scholars argue it derives from the Berber word Amadis, meaning sovereign or queen, a title for priestesses who channeled the goddess Anath. Over centuries, as Greek identity coalesced around tales of heroes conquering chaos, these sovereigns were recast as obstacles to be beheaded. Perseus' myth enacts this cultural theft. His theft of Medusa's head mirrors Greek appropriation of Libyan iconography, her power literally severed and repurposed as a weapon for his patron goddess Athena. Yet traces of the old reverence linger. In some Libyan oral traditions, Medusa's blood didn't birth monsters, it fertilized the desert, creating veins of red coral in the Mediterranean. Her face, once a shield against evil, still adorns amazing jewelry as a talisman, a silent rebellion against the Hellenized monster myth. Even the snakes tell a story. Libyan horned vipers were sacred to Neith, their venom used in rituals to induce visions. When Athenian playwrights described Medusa's hair as hissing, they unknowingly preserved a fragment of pharmacology. Priestesses may have ingested serpent venom to commune with the divine, their trances misinterpreted as monstrous rage. What makes this myth's journey so haunting isn't just the distortion, but the desperation beneath it. The Greeks didn't merely fear these foreign women. They feared how closely they resembled their own untamed goddesses before Zeus subdued them. Medusa's original role as a guardian of thresholds, a liminal figure between life and death, echoes in the way her petrifying gaze survives in apotropaic architecture, warding off evil even as her story was weaponized against her. That duality endures today. Feminists reclaim her as a symbol of survivor's rage, while scholars peel back layers of colonial storytelling to find the sovereign beneath the snarl. The next time you see her face, whether on a temple pediment or a protest poster, remember, every monster is someone's divinity in exile. Plato's Atlantis wasn't just a sunken city, it was a warning. In his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BCE, he described a naval power beyond the Pillars of Hercules that conquered much of Europe and North Africa before sinking into the sea in a single day and night of misfortune. For centuries, scholars dismissed it as pure fiction, a moral allegory about hubris. But in the late 19th century, archaeologists began unearthing clues that Plato's tale might have been rooted in a real catastrophe, one that obliterated a civilization nearly 1,000 years before his time. The key lies in Santorini, known in antiquity as Thera. Around 1600 BCE, this volcanic island exploded with a force estimated to be 4 times stronger than Krakatoa, triggering tsunamis that radiated across the Mediterranean. The fresco-covered walls of Akrotiri, a Minoan settlement on Thera, bear silent witness to the disaster. Buildings preserved mid-collapse, their storerooms still stacked with giant pithoi jars, as if the inhabitants fled without warning. Nearby Crete, the heart of Minoan civilization, was pummeled by ashfall and tidal waves, its coastal palaces reduced to rubble. To the Egyptians, who traded extensively with the Minoans, the sudden silence from these Keftiu people must have seemed like the disappearance of an entire world. Geology offers chilling parallels to Plato's account. His description of Atlantis' circular capital with concentric rings of water and land mirrors Thera's pre-eruption geography, a volcanic caldera surrounded by islands. The impenetrable mud he claimed covered the sunken city. That's volcanic pumice, which still floats in thick rafts around Santorini today. Even the timeline fits. Egyptian priests told Solon of a catastrophe 9,000 years before his time, but if years was a mistranslation of lunar cycles, it aligns almost perfectly with Thera's eruption. Yet the most compelling evidence isn't in the ruins, it's in the myth's endurance. Thera's explosion was so cataclysmic, it left fingerprints in global folklore. The biblical plagues of Egypt, possibly effects of volcanic winter, the Greek tale of Deucalion's flood, a distorted memory of the tsunamis, even Plato's insistence that Atlantis lay beyond the known world makes sense if the story traveled through generations, its origins obscured by time. What makes Atlantis more than just a fallen city is how Plato weaponized its memory. His Atlantis wasn't merely powerful, it was corrupt, its people drunk on their own technology until the gods punished them. That moralizing twist mirrors real anxieties in 4th century BCE Athens, where naval imperialism and luxury were fracturing society. The Minoans, with their flush toilets and vibrant art, may have been the perfect cautionary tale for a civilization teetering on the edge of its own excess. Modern searches for Atlantis often fixate on underwater ruins, but the truth might be stranger. Thera's eruption didn't just sink an island, it shattered a cultural epoch. When Plato wrote of Atlantis sinking into the sea, he could have been describing the collapse of Bronze Age connectivity, a network of trade and ideas that vanished beneath waves of ash and time. Today, as we scan ocean floors with sonar and debate climate change, Atlantis whispers back, every civilization thinks itself invincible, until the Earth reminds it otherwise. In the shadow of Mount Pion, near the bustling streets of ancient Ephesus, lay a forgotten cave where 7 young men once closed their eyes only to wake up centuries later in a world where Christianity, the very faith they'd been persecuted for, now reigned supreme. The legend of the 7 Sleepers is one of history's most haunting time-warp tales, but its roots twist far deeper than Christian hagiography. Long before these youths became saints, the Mediterranean whispered of mortals who cheated time through supernatural slumber, their stories echoing from Greek myth to Islamic tradition in a saga that refuses to stay buried. The Christian version, recorded in the 6th century by Bishop Gregory of Tours, tells of 7 noble youths who fled Roman Emperor Decius' persecution in the 3rd century, hiding in a cave where God placed them in a divinely induced sleep. When they awoke, some say 200 years later, others 300, they stumbled into Ephesus expecting to face execution, only to find crosses emblazoned on buildings and a populace baffled by their antiquated coins. Their miraculous return proved the resurrection of the dead, and when they finally passed away naturally, the city enshrined them as martyrs. But peel back the layers and you'll find an older story hibernating beneath. Greek lore speaks of Epimenides, a shepherd who dozed for 57 years in a Cretan cave, awakening with prophetic gifts. Similar tales swirl around the cult of Asclepius, where temple initiates underwent incubation sleep, their dreams believed to carry healing visions from the god. Even older is the Near Eastern myth of Dumuzi, the shepherd god whose seasonal death and return mirrored agricultural cycles. The 7 Sleepers story grafts these ancient motifs onto Christian theology, transforming pagan time bending into proof of divine power. What's fascinating is how the tale mutated across cultures. The Quran's Surah Al-Kahf venerates the sleepers as righteous men shielded by Allah, their cave guarded by a divine dog named Kitmir. Byzantine chroniclers claimed their bodies remained incorruptible, their faces flushed as if only napping, and in medieval Europe, their legend morphed into a cautionary fable about the passage of time sleepers who awaken to find their loved ones' dust, their homes swallowed by forests. Archaeology adds another twist. In the late 19th century, excavations near Ephesus uncovered a cave lined with 5th century burial niches and inscriptions to the 7. But here's the catch, the site was already a place of veneration before Christianity, possibly tied to older chthonic rites. Some scholars argue the sleepers were repurposed local spirits, their story Christianized to overwrite pagan memory. Even their number 7 reeks of symbolism, echoing the 7 planets of antiquity or the Pleiades star cluster tied to Greek myth. The real power of this myth isn't just in the sleep but the awakening. Whether pagan or Christian, these stories grapple with time's elasticity, how faith or fate can suspend mortality's rules. In modern Turkey, the cave is still a pilgrimage site where visitors whisper prayers for those caught between eras. And perhaps that's why the legend endures. It lets us imagine that somewhere, in some hidden chamber, sleepers still wait to rise, their closed eyes holding secrets not just of the past, but of futures we've yet to dream. Nightfall in ancient Rome brought more than darkness. It summoned the Strix, a creature neither fully owl nor demon, whose piercing screech sent parents bolting to their children's cribs. This wasn't just any predator. The Strix craved the warm breath of newborns, its needle-thin beak poised to siphon life from sleeping infants like some macabre nectar. Roman poets like Ovid described these horrors in visceral detail: talons scratching at shutters, wings beating against rooftops. But the true terror lay in what the Strix represented, a supernatural scapegoat for one of antiquity's most agonizing realities. In a world where nearly a third of infants never saw their first birthday, the Strix gave shape to the invisible threats that stole children in the night. Digging deeper reveals a creature stitched together from half-understood phenomena. The Strix's screech mirrors the eerie calls of real owls like the tawny or barn owl, birds often associated with death in Mediterranean folklore. Its alleged ability to drain breath may stem from encounters with sudden infant death syndrome (SIDS), where babies perished without visible cause. Ancient medical texts like those of Sirens even warned against night vapors suffocating infants, a theory that aligns uncomfortably with modern understandings of sleep apnea. But the Strix myth also served a darker social function. Lamia, the Libyan child snatching demons, had their Roman counterpart in these owl-like horrors, reinforcing the idea that negligent mothers invited supernatural retribution. What transforms the Strix from folklore to cultural landmark is its vampiric legacy. Centuries before Bram Stoker penned Dracula, Roman amulets featured charms against the Strix's bloodless feeding, an early nod to energy vampirism. The creature's traits slithered into medieval tales of strigoi, restless spirits who preyed on the living, and later into Slavic vampire myths. Even the Strix's weakness being repelled by loud noises resurfaces in Balkan traditions of clanging pots to scare off undead. Archaeologists have found infant graves across the Roman Empire lined with pierced potsherds, likely meant to trap or confuse these airborne predators in the afterlife. The most chilling aspect isn't the monster's design, but its endurance. Today, the Strix lives on in language the Italian strega, witch, and Romanian strigoi, vampire, both descend from this ancient terror. Its shadow falls across modern horror tropes, from nocturnal child snatchers in folklore to the psychic vampires of urban legend. When parents check nursery monitors or hang dream catchers, they're participating in a ritual as old as Rome itself, the human need to name the unnameable, to fight back against the darkness with whatever charms we can fashion. The Strix reminds us that every generation has its monsters, but sometimes the real horror is what those monsters force us to confront about ourselves. Deep in the labyrinthine workshops of ancient Crete, where bronze scraps littered the floor like fallen stars, the legendary craftsman Daedalus was said to have performed miracles beyond mere engineering. He breathed life into metal and wood. According to fragmentary texts and whispered legends, his statues weren't just art, they were autonomous beings capable of movement so fluid it unsettled even kings. One account describes a wooden figure of Aphrodite that turned its head to follow admirers, its eyes gleaming with what observers swore was real desire. Another tells of a bronze giant, Talos' smaller cousin, that reportedly leaped from its plinth to escape a thief's grasping hands, sprinting down temple steps with a clangor that woke the entire city. What makes these accounts so compelling isn't just their strangeness, it's the tantalizing evidence that some form of ancient robotics might have inspired them. Archaeologists have uncovered 5th century Greek automatons like the dove of Archytas, a steam-powered bird capable of short flights. Daedalus, if he existed, would have worked centuries earlier, but the principles weren't beyond Bronze Age ingenuity. Imagine a statue with limbs jointed by tendons of oxhide, its movements powered by hidden weights or water channels crude by modern standards, but miraculous to eyes unaccustomed to anything but static idols. Even the fleeing statue could have been an early example of kinetic art, balanced so precariously that a touch sent it toppling in a way that mimicked flight. Yet Daedalus's creations carried darker implications. Plato wrote of statues so lifelike they needed to be chained at night, lest they wander off like restless slaves. This wasn't just about mechanics, it reflected ancient fears of creation surpassing its creator. Daedalus, after all, was also the architect of the labyrinth, a prison so perfect even he barely escaped it. His statues embodied the same tension, marvels that blurred the line between devotion and dominion. A moving idol might inspire awe, but what if it decided to disobey? The most haunting tale comes from a crumbling Alexandrian scroll, which claims Daedalus crafted a doll in his dead son's likeness, a figure that could weep real tears from hidden reservoirs. When King Minos demanded the secret, the inventor allegedly dismantled it before his eyes, scattering gears like the bones of a butchered child. Whether fact or metaphor, the story cuts to the heart of these myths, the agony of giving life, then being powerless to protect it. Modern robotics resurrects these ancient dreams. When we watch humanoid robots mimic facial expressions or drones swarm like starlings, we're chasing the same wonder Daedalus inspired. Yet the old warnings linger in ethical debates about AI autonomy. Maybe that's why his statues haunt us still, not as relics of primitive tech, but as mirrors to our own hunger to play God. The next time your smart speaker responds without prompting, remember, that unnerving thrill was familiar long before silicon. Bronze Age artisans felt it too, staring at a statue that blinked back. From the Minotaur's cursed labyrinth to the singing ruins of the Colossus of Rhodes, these Mediterranean myths aren't just fantastical tales, they're a window into how ancient civilizations grappled with forces beyond their understanding. Think about the sheer ingenuity behind these stories. The Hydra's regenerating heads capturing the chaos of swamps that resisted human control, the magnetic mountain explaining sudden ship disappearances, or Lamia's monstrous grief giving shape to the unbearable pain of child loss. Each myth served as both warning and wonder, transforming earthquakes into divine punishments and volcanic vents into the breath of monsters. Consider how many of these legends emerged from real-world observations. The Cyclops myth likely sprang from dwarf elephant skulls mistaken for one-eyed giants, while the gold-digging ants Herodotus described were probably marmots kicking up precious dust in Himalayan valleys. Even the lotus eater's narcotic paradise might reflect early encounters with hallucinogenic plants like blue lotus. These weren't mere flights of fancy, they were attempts to make sense of a world where science hadn't yet separated fact from phenomenon. What's truly remarkable is how these stories still resonate. When we describe complex problems as hydra-headed or speak of siren calls, we're invoking myths thousands of years old. The Oracle of Delphi's gaseous prophecies find echoes in modern confirmation bias, while Tolo's the bronze automaton feels eerily prescient in an age of AI and drones. The ancients may not have understood geomagnetism or microbial infections, but their narratives distilled universal human fears of the unknown, of technology outpacing ethics, of nature's indifference to our struggles. As we revisit these myths, it's worth asking which ones might hold fragments of forgotten truths. Could the drifting isle of Aeolia encode memories of volcanic fog illusions? Might the Blemmyes' headless existence stem from encounters with warriors in ceremonial headgear? Every legend is a puzzle box waiting to be opened, layered with cultural memory and observational genius. Now we'd love to hear from you which Mediterranean myth lingers in your imagination. Is it the eerie precision of the Minotaur's labyrinth, the cosmic dread of Gugalana's celestial bull, or something even more obscure? Drop your favorites in the comments, and who knows, maybe your pick holds a hidden truth we've yet to uncover. After all, the greatest lesson these myths teach is that the boundary between fact and folklore was never as solid as we think. It's more like the shifting sands where the Sphinx still waits, whispering riddles across